Welcome to the France 24 debate. I'm Marco, and all of a sudden it's neck and neck in the race for the Élysée. Emmanuel Macron was sitting pretty and on course for a walkover return to the Élysée for a second term. So the question is, how has April turned into the cruellest month for the sitting French president? Macron's second term is under a real and present threat. The polls in March and the polls in April show the real closing of the gap between Macron and his rivals. This is in terms of voting intention if, as predicted, there's a Macron-Le Pen face-off in the second round. So, here to discuss why and how this springtime election is threatening to lead to a summer of discontent for Macron's La République En Marche party, we have, by no order of preference, because all our guests are equal and equally welcome here at France 24. In the studio, from the Atlantic Council, Nicolas Duncan, Senior Fellow of that organisation and CEO of Cogito Praxis. Great to see you, sir. Joining us from Newcastle, that's Newcastle under Lyme, in the northeast of England, Ariane Bourgain, lecturer in French politics at the University of Northumbria. Ariane, great to see you. Thanks for being with us. Joining us from Berlin, Yves Saint-Omer, he's a lecturer in political science at the Université Paris 8, but joining us from Berlin, Germany, just to keep us on our toes. Yves, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
And in the studio, back to the studio, Philippe Toll, France 24's international affairs editor, long-time observer of the French political scene. Now, before I let the guests loose, let me just tell you, France 24 is planning an election special. Here's now François Picard, who I spoke to earlier, with a 60-second setup of what's at stake for the Présidentielle 2022.
Yes, we're plotting and scheming ahead of Sunday, Mark, and gotta say, it's been relatively muted up until about 36 hours ago. In a nation that's normally politics mad, it had been quiet. The war in Ukraine had instead grabbed all the headlines. But now the attention is focusing on the campaign. Things like spending power coming into focus. And Emmanuel Macron's lead has shrunk to within the margin of error when it comes to the second round, the April 24th runoff. So a strange campaign at the outset, one that's been short, and not the big campaign rallies of old. Part of that has to do with the fact that we're coming out of a pandemic, but also this unease over what is the big issue going into Sunday.
François Picard with that. The rest of the team, of course, with him. A French election special on the first round coming up on Sunday. Nicolas Duncan, can I bring you in first, sir? What has happened? Why has Macron's lead seemingly been eroded in this way?
I think he's in a trap of his own making to some extent. And I hope that as we progress in this discussion, we can talk about all the contrasts with 5 years ago, but he's probably going to be facing the same person in the second round, as you said. But the trap of his own making is that almost miraculously, quite unexpectedly, he surprised us all 5 years ago by blowing out the old left, blowing out the old right. He exploded both oppositions at the same time. So now there's no legitimate opposition in France to put a candidate up against him. And therefore, we have Marine Le Pen, the extreme right candidate, who's trying to portray herself as no longer extreme right. So in a sense, it's a victim of his own success.
Nicolas, thank you very much indeed. Let's bring in Ariane from Northumbria University. Can you hear us now, Ariane? Great to have you there.
Yes, I can.
Emmanuel Macron, a victim of his own success, says Nicolas Duncan here. I think it's fair to see exactly what Nicolas means. Do you have a different interpretation as to what has happened to this lead? If we believe the opinion polls, of course, it's going to be extremely tight. Too close for comfort, of course, for La République En Marche, if it gets to the second round that way.
Yeah, I totally agree with what's been said, but I would add to this the fact that, to me, it's been a very, very poor campaign, if we can even call it a campaign for Macron. Because, he for weeks, he wasn't actually present. And as a candidate, you need to be on the ground. You need to show that you want it. And, using delegates or, ministers is not the same. So the invisibility really, didn't do him any favor. But the main issue I have is with the messaging. If I want to become the president of France, I will want to be, to tell people, vote for me and I'll make your life better, however you define better. He spent, a long time in a press conference outlining his program. What were the headlines? All the headlines in the press and the media after that, it was the French will have to work better. That is the worst messaging you can get. So it's just a major blunder. And then we have the fact that he has refused to do debate. And to me, it smacks of arrogance, as in I'm too big. I'm not going to enter into the fray with all the minnows. Or it's smack of being very thin-skinned, and he doesn't want to get all the flack that inevitably he would get. So I would say that his campaign has been very, very bad.
He did say at the start, though, didn't he, Ariane, that he wanted to be like Jupiter. So maybe he warned us at the beginning what it was going to be like. Thank you very much for now. Let's bring in Yves, who's in Berlin waiting for us. Yves Sintomer. Yves, has the problem been perhaps that Emmanuel Macron's had a little bit too much on his plate, as we like to say in English? The question being that he's at the same time President of France and also President of Europe.
No, I don't think so. I think that Macron's strength 5 years ago was more due to the weakness of his opponents than to his own strengths. And his most important strength was, I'm new, I will change everything. 5 years later, it's not the case, and so he's no part of the old politics. And the state of the French politics now is a disaster. Look, it's the campaign in which citizenry has not been interested in. Mm-hmm. It's the most important election in France, and all polls show that French don't like this election, this campaign at least. You have the far right, which is at more than 30% in the first round, and nearly winning in the second round, according to the polls. The political parties are in a disarray, total disarray. So really, we are in a very difficult situation. And in this very difficult situation, President Macron has made what he has done during 5 years. He has been arrogant. He has behaved as if he was winning in all cases. And I think that a lot of citizens don't like it.
And certainly his opponents don't like it either. They've accused him of trying to duck any kind of debate, something he's been accused of. He's appeared on national TV a couple of times to announce a couple of policies. And as we've heard, it hasn't gone down extremely well. Yves, thank you for now. Let's bring in Philip Turle, our international affairs editor, but observer of the French political scene for many an election, shall we say.
Since 1988.
Good man. I'm glad you pointed that out. Okay. Nicolas mentioned earlier that Macron was new and blew it all apart. Has that been the problem, that he's created this vacuum and now he's actually fallen into it in a sense?
Well, I think there are several aspects to this. I think one of the first ones is that Macron started off quite well in this campaign, and then he suddenly saw a rapid increase in his support base, particularly since the start of the war in Ukraine, and saw himself as like the world leader who was in direct negotiations with Vladimir Putin, was heading the European Union, the European Council for 6 months, something that France didn't necessarily have to do. It was offered that France could delay that until after the election. Macron said, no, we're going to do it straight away.
Philip, do you think that was weighed on his actual ability to operate as a president candidate? That fact
yes,
that
which
he's been preoccupied with
what I was going to say is that all of that has added on extra responsibility to Emmanuel Macron. He was going to use to his advantage to try to say, well, look, I am the world leader. I am trying to solve the war in Ukraine. Well, here we are a month into the war. Nothing really appears to have changed. Vladimir Putin hasn't changed his attitude. There is no ceasefire. There are no troop withdrawals. Many people are saying, why is Emmanuel Macron still talking to Vladimir Putin? This hasn't paid off. And at the same time, you had this McKinsey scandal about this consultancy group that was allegedly paid hundreds of millions of euros for consultancy fees out of public taxes or taxpayers' money, which has also come along as like a stink bomb right at the right moment for the opposition in this campaign. So it sort of dragged it down. And I agree with everybody else who's spoken before me that I think Emmanuel Macron has sort of taken it for granted or hoped it was going to be just a formality. This election was going to go through it easily. He didn't really have to make an effort, didn't really have to get down into the arena with the other candidates, which is something that other presidential candidates haven't done in the past as well. He's not the only one, but he was sort of saying, OK, I'll declare my candidacy as late as possible. I won't take part in some of these radio and television programs that the other candidates are taking part in, even though we're not discussing things together. And I think that instead of putting him in a position of he is the only one capable of defending France and taking France into the next mandate, a lot of people have said, well, hold on a minute, this man doesn't appear to be taking any part in the election campaign. We don't know what he wants to do. He's not discussing any of the election issues. He seems to be hiding in the wings, and therefore that's not a good sign.
Let's put up the polls from today so we can get a sense of what the whole field is like for this. So that's most of the field, isn't it? I think the top 5 candidates there. So we've got Macron in yellow, they're leading. Le Pen next, then Mélenchon, who's the kind of like the great hope for the left. Then we have we have Valérie Pécresse of the centre-right, Les Républicains, known usually as the party of Nicolas Sarkozy because of his overburdening presence and influence in that party. And at the end there, Éric Zemmour, the kind of like ultra-far-right polemicist, alleged journalist who is standing and tapping into a lot of far-right feeling in France, particularly popular amongst the gendarmes, I read in Le Canard Enchaîné, the satirical paper here. Let's keep that on screen so people can look at that for a bit and bring in Nicholas Dungan again to ask that question about Vladimir Putin and Emmanuel Macron. Should he have stopped speaking to him, do you think, or was he right to think that he could, as President of Europe, keep that dialogue going to somehow open the door towards a diplomatic solution?
I think that what Macron did, and his poll numbers hadn't dropped at that point, and they didn't drop right after that, was what the French expect the President of the French Republic to do. That France should speak to everyone, that France should be a peacemaker, that France is a great power, it's a global power, it may not be a superpower, but it's somebody who is more global than global Britain. And let's not forget that he was talking to Putin mainly before Putin invaded. There was some conversations afterwards, but that, if I recall correctly, the one at the long table was actually before hostilities started, before we started to see some of these atrocities. So I think from that standpoint, he did what corresponded to the expectations of the French as President of the Republic. But what all of the speakers have mentioned is that he is expected to be a candidate and to act like a candidate, and that he seems to have lost the opportunity and maybe lost the ability to connect with what Yves was saying, the citizenry. And the citizens, when they go to vote, they want to know that he can represent the country, which people have doubts about whether Marine Le Pen can do it. But when they go to vote, they want to vote for somebody who they think represents them. And that is the problem. And what I would say is the likely problem of the first round, which could be worse or better in the second round, we'll have to see, is the apathy that goes with abstention, or the apathy that causes abstention. And if there's a high abstention number, something in excess of 25%, then basically the polls that you were showing, they're narrowing with Marine Le Pen. Marine Le Pen's supporters are much more engaged. They're much more committed. And for example, the people who would have voted for the Socialist Party, whereas Macron has tacked right over the last 5 years on many, many issues. So, you have what are called the bobos, right? The bourgeois bohème, the hipsters. Yeah, they think to the left, and they've got a BMW SUV in the garage. But they are the ones that he needs those votes, right? And Mélenchon, for example, the far left firebrand, has said, I would encourage my supporters to abstain in the second round, right? And the more abstentions there are, the worse it is for Macron. So I think that, yes, he was with Vladimir Putin. Yes, he was with Joe Biden. He's been at NATO repeatedly. He's been in Brussels repeatedly. He was president of Europe in the sense that France had the presidency of the European Council. He was the first major European statesman to try to talk to Putin. That role was fine in those circumstances. But as you said, this is April. That was March. And April is the cruelest month.
Indeed. T.S. Eliot coming back again. you recognised that straight away, didn't you? Let's take a look at our report now regarding the situation regarding the French left. In disarray after the last presidential election, of course, the Socialist Party went basically bankrupt. The main hope now is this man, Mélenchon. Let's take a look.
These voters are still convinced it's possible for the left to make it to the second round. Their bets are on Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Earlier this week, he held rallies in 12 cities simultaneously, thanks to his hologram.
Macron est le seul qui puisse donner espoir aux Français d'une meilleure vie, en fait.
Here in northern France, his supporters mobilized for last-minute campaigning. And even though socialists have held the city of Lille for nearly 70 years, many of its left-wing voters remain undecided.
C'est bien qu'ils ne feront pas un très grand score, donc c'est un peu compliqué de savoir vers qui se tourner.
Tout le monde s'est tiré une balle dans le pied et au final, il n'y a plus de crédibilité dans le vote de gauche maintenant.
Supporters of the Socialist Party in Paris are no less optimistic.
On n'est pas dans l'illusoire à se dire qu'Hidalgo va gagner présidentielle. On est déjà dans la reconstruction, dans la suite, dans l'avenir.
A more sustainable future, at least for the Green Party, which made a final appeal to voters in the suburb of Nanterre. Many here as well still haven't made up their minds. That's enough to convince these Yannick Jadot campaigners not to give up.
Il reste encore beaucoup de personnes qui sont indécises, qui ne savent pas pour qui elles vont aller voter, même si elles vont aller voter. Donc il reste encore quelques jours pour aller les convaincre.
Another option on the left, Communist Party candidate Fabien Roussel. Recent polling suggests he'll obtain less than 5% of the vote, but his supporters too remain loyal.
Au premier tour, il faut voter pour ses valeurs, pour ses convictions, et du coup, c'est ce que je vais faire.
With just a few days to go until the first round, the left has rarely appeared so unpopular. Less than a third of French voters say they'll support a left-wing candidate.
Let's bring in Ariane Bourgoin from the University of Northumbria. She's in Newcastle upon Tyne, which is reputed to be a hotbed of the left in the UK. But all that changed, of course, at the last election. Things got jiggled about, didn't they, Ariane, a little bit? I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the left here in France. So let's talk about that. Mélenchon, can he rise to the... Well, can he stand up to the plate and knock the ball out of the park, do you think?
I think he has a chance. I genuinely think he has a chance. We have to remember that Mélenchon is a very, very good campaigner. He's a very good orator. And his ascendancy this time round is very similar to what happened in 2017. It started around about 9-10% and then push up. I think he has a chance, and it will depend, first of all, on tactical voting, on the anti-Macron voting, deciding to vote for Mélenchon, not because they like him, but to get rid of Macron. And I think it will also depend on the late vote switcher. There was a study yesterday that suggested that 32% of the French said that they're considering changing at the last minute, and the vast majority of them were on the left. So we could have a push towards Mélenchon to block Macron. So I think he has a chance. I'm not saying it's necessarily going to happen, but it does have a chance, yes. That declaration,
Nicolas was talking about it, that Mélenchon says about sort of telling his people not to vote or to abstain in the next round. Is that childish to the point of irresponsibility?
I mean, my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, was that he is going to ask his supporters what they want to do in the second round. But what is likely to happen if it is Le Pen versus Macron, there's a high likelihood of high abstention amongst left voters who do not want to vote for Macron. And as a result, as Nicolas, I think, says, it will favour Le Pen. But, the second round is a different, for the first round, I think he has a chance. A slight, but a chance.
Ariane, you said correct you if you're wrong. I would dare not correct a lecturer. Thank you very much indeed. Bear with us, please. Let's bring in Yves, who's in Berlin. This whole perspective, Yves, about the dealing with Putin, I'm wondering about how that sits with you about Macron and his continuing to talk to Putin. What do you feel about that?
I think that it was right for a French president and a French president of the EU to both sustain Ukraine and to speak with Putin. I mean, first, before the war, to try to do the best to avoid the war, and then even within the war, we'll have at some point to accept peace talks and peace discussions. And in this, Europe has to be not only a powerful unity which sustains Ukraine, but also a mediator between different views. So I think he was right to do it. For sure, the atrocities that the Russian army has committed makes dialogue much more difficult. But at some point, there will be a dialogue. And in this process, it's normal that the French president, as a German president, will speak to the enemy.
Yves, Macron, the only candidate who speaks to Putin, but the other candidates, if I'm not mistaken, and correct me if I am wrong, have a certain leaning towards Putin. I mean, obviously, one says that they prefer to speak to Putin than to anybody in the US. There's a whole sense among many of these candidates that, Putin's the kind of person they would speak to and they would do business with, of course, before the war. I wonder whether that will count against the candidates other than Macron.
I mean, it's quite clear that Zemmour was too close with Putin and that it was a bad thing for him in the campaign. Marine Le Pen and Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who had ambiguities on this subject, has not lost because of their former proximity with Putin for Marine Le Pen and ambiguity for Jean-Luc Mélenchon. I think we have also to understand that in France, the idea that France has to be autonomous, that France, since de Gaulle, has a role in the world which must differ from the US is a strong feeling, and that perhaps due to this tradition, the proximity with Putin has not been a disaster neither for Marine Le Pen nor for Mélenchon.
Yves in Berlin, thank you very much indeed. From Berlin, let's go to Perpignan, where we find Clovis Casali, our reporter, intrepid reporter no less, following Marine Le Pen, which has had a rally. Clovis, over to you.
Well, I can tell you that here the supporters are ecstatic. Marine Le Pen is addressing supporters right now in Perpignan, in the southwest of France. She's told them change has never been so close. For the first time, the French far right could win the presidential election. Those were her words. And when we speak to the supporters here, they are convinced she finally stands a chance. One supporter was telling us, well, she seems more moderate than before, even though she hasn't changed on the issues such as immigration, cracking down on immigration by all means, which is an issue that's always been close to the hearts of supporters of the National Front and before of the Front National and now of the Rassemblement National, the national rally. Supporters here say she's much better prepared than 5 years ago and that she can win, and also that she's the only candidate who can save France. Let's take a listen to some of these supporters here in Perpignan.
It's especially for the safety of the French people today, especially in Perpignan. We have some security issues, especially in the center of town, and we'd like it to be safer. Her image has softened a little, and people are less scared to vote for her. But make no mistake about it, it is still the same party. It will always be the same.
Yeah, Marine Le Pen supporter. Let's go back to Clovis. It's been a difficult relationship between her and the other far-right candidate, Éric Zemmour.
Yes, absolutely. Remember when Éric Zemmour, the former journalist, stormed onto the political scene, disrupted it very, very much. Well, everybody thought that he would be taking votes away, taking part of the electorate of Marine Le Pen, because he's kind of on the same position, the French far right. But she changed, she softened her tone, her message, and she lost many heavyweights from her party, MPs and even her own niece, Marion Maréchal, who joined Éric Zemmour. So all observers, many people thought, Well, this is going to be a very difficult election and campaign for Marine Le Pen. When we saw her during the campaign at Reims, for instance, another big rally for her, well, she did seem extremely tired and disenchanted by the way some had betrayed her. And still, she is higher than ever in the polls. It's never been such a tight call between her and Macron. She's tipped, of course, to get to the second round of the presidential election. When you ask people from the National Rally, the entourage of Marine Le Pen, what do you think about all these heavyweights leaving, betraying the candidates? Well, they say it doesn't change a thing. They weren't happy, they can just leave. And anyway, the reality is that the French people, or the electorate of the National Rally, love Marine Le Pen. They call her Marine affectionately, and she is the candidate who's managing this campaign, for her voters at least, to really put purchasing power at the heart of all of this campaign and at the heart of this election, maybe putting aside other issues that she traditionally campaigned on, such as immigration, security and Islam. During her speech here, she called upon all voters of all origins, of all religions, to come and join her. But she also said that it was the French before anyone else that she was defending. France first, and that's always been the position of the National Rally. Marine Le Pen convinced here in Perpignan that she will win this election, and she's also calling for huge turnout. She's asking all the people
Clovis,
here,
thank you very much indeed, sir. We need to leave it there. Thank you, Clovis Casali there in Perpignan. Thank you, sir, very much indeed. Let's come back to the studio. Philip, Clovis, we're getting the picture there, definitely, that Le Pen trying to rebrand herself, but to coin an old phrase, I mean, a leopard doesn't really change its spots, does it?
Okay, there are several things here which are important to notice. I think Marine Le Pen has worked a lot on herself since the disastrous debate between the two rounds of the election in 2017. It has to be known that in France there are two rounds of the election, and the first round anybody can run if they get 500 signatures of elected officials, and then the top two from the first round go through to a second round runoff, and there's usually a debate now between those two candidates. In 2017 it was a debate that was a disaster for Marine Le Pen. She was walked all over by Emmanuel Macron, and many people thought she was politically finished afterwards. So she's rebuilt herself since then. She's much wiser now. She's made her party much more acceptable to people, at least on to most people. They will think it's become a normal party. But if you look underneath, it's still a very far-right nationalist party with very far-right policies. So she's now managed to use that image of normality to try to regain support, which she's done. She's taken advantage of the fact that Eric Zemmour created this buzz by being the sort of replacement candidate for Marine Le Pen. It hasn't really pulled off because Eric Zemmour is never going to reunite France, which is what Marine Le Pen wants to do, to get people from all walks of life to vote for her. That was something Eric Zemmour would never do. He was more like a protest candidate. And the other thing which is very important to notice here is that imagine that Marine Le Pen gets through to the second round with Emmanuel Macron. She has a much larger reserve of possible voters than Emmanuel Macron has, because she will pick up the voters of Eric Zemmour, probably. She will also pick up, I would imagine, quite a large number of voters from Valérie Pécresse of the Republican Party. Some will go and vote for Emmanuel Macron. She will call for them to vote for Emmanuel Macron, but some will go and support Marine Le Pen. And she may even pick up some voters who would have voted for Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the far-left candidate, in the first round, who will then automatically transfer their votes to the far-right candidate because they do not want Emmanuel Macron. There is this sort of phrase in France which is tout sauf Macron, everything except Macron, which means that those voters will not vote for him. They'd rather vote for Marine Le Pen. And of course, coupled with that, everything else we've been talking around the table here tonight is the big question mark over, well, how much abstention will there be? Will people not vote in the second round? Because if they don't vote, that will automatically increase the chances of Marine Le Pen winning.
A normalisation of the far right, it seems to me quite shocking. French court 8 years ago, I think, ruled that Marine Le Pen could be called a fascist. That was a legal ruling, which she disputed the word fascist. The judges said, well, actually, you can be called a fascist. That was a ruling. Nicholas, your thoughts, please. I know you've got lots to say.
Thank you. I hope so.
You always do.
I think one thing that could be very interesting for the English-speaking audience, who probably don't look at French politics every minute, is to understand a little bit about how the system works. And I wanted to pick up on something that one of the ladies, French ladies, were being interviewed about. Mélenchon said.
Yeah.
She said in the first round.
I think they were Le Pen supporters, weren't they?
Well, she said. Somebody said in the first round you vote your values.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So now
You're right.
what I think is important to understand is, in France, all elections are in 2 rounds. The first round is as many candidates as are eligible. The second round is only the 2 finalists. On the legislative elections, which I want to come back to in just 1 second, that's 1 week apart. Deliberately in the presidential elections, it's 2 weeks apart so that you have time for the debate, so that people have time to think. So this lady was saying, in the first round of the presidential election, you vote your values. But then in the second round, you know you're choosing the president of the republic. In the first round, you're basically voting, it's a statement, right? So here, the problem is, as we were saying, that we've got Macron, who is viewed as being a good president of the republic, but in many ways a bad candidate. Now, the other reason why voting for Marine Le Pen is a free vote is that some years ago in France, the presidential term was shortened from 7 years to 5 years. By shortening it to 5 years, the presidential term became of the same length as the term of the National Assembly, which means that as 5 years ago and as 5 years before that, the legislative elections, which are necessary to form a government, which has to be approved by the National Assembly, get a vote of confidence in the National Assembly, because we're in a presidential parliamentary system here, those elections follow only a few weeks after the presidential election. So, what if I don't want to vote for Macron? What if I decide not to abstain and I vote for Marine Le Pen and she becomes president of the Republic? Then a few weeks later, I'm going to vote in the National Assembly elections, and I can deny her the ability to govern. I can deny her the ability, or the French people can deny her the ability to implement her program if she's too far right.
This is a dangerous game, Nicolas Dungan.
But the fact is, that young lady was saying, in the first round for the presidential, you vote your values. In the second round, you vote for whoever you want to vote for. And what I'm saying is, they're not just 2 rounds. There are 4 rounds. There's the first round and second round of the presidential election, and a few weeks later, there's the legislative elections, where you can actually, and even if Macron is reelected, which is still, based on the Economist polls, it's still, or the Economist algorithm, it's still, it was 97% a few weeks ago. Now it's only 75%. But that's still 3 chances out of 4. So if Macron is reelected, the chances are he won't be able to get a legislative majority from his own party like he did last time. So essentially, you're going to have a coalition. Eve is shaking his head, so he's not liking this at all.
Thank you for telling me.
But you could have him and having to form a coalition beneath the president.
But it already happened twice in France. Once under François Mitterrand, where he had to govern with Édouard Balladur, who was a right-wing prime minister, and then again under Jacques Chirac, who had to govern with Lionel Jospin. That's in the last 20 years. So it's not an impossible. And then you have a situation where you have a government in charge and a lame-duck president.
Eve in Berlin, you're shaking your head. You've got the floor. Tell us what you're thinking.
That was my cue to you, Eve.
I mean, in the past, when presidential elections and legislative elections did not happen at the same time, or after 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, one after the other, then the possibility to have 2 majorities, one for the president and one for the legislative assembly, was a real possibility. And in fact, there had been several cases in which the president and the legislative majority were not on the same board. Precisely the reform which was made a couple of years ago, which consisted, as it was said, to put the legislative elections a couple of weeks just after the presidential elections, was made in order to have the same majority for the president and for the assembly. And until now, it has always been the case. So I think it's very difficult now to say what will happen if Macron or Le Pen or even Mélenchon win the presidential elections. It is quite probable that if Macron is again elected, then the right the Republican, so-called Republican right, will be hugely divided, that a lot of politicians who want to save their career will rally Macron, and it's not that probable that two majorities will be opposed, one with the president and one with the legislative assembly. With Le Pen, it's an open scenario. We would not have seen this in the past, so it's quite difficult to make pronostics. But all this remembers us that we are in a very strange situation. Who could have thought a couple of years ago that we would have had this, competition with no guarantee of success for the center-right, which is Macron, and the far-right, which is Le Pen. What a situation. And I think that one lesson we can draw right now is that the status quo is not an option if we want to avoid real dangers in the future, perhaps in a near future. If it's not in a near future, in a longer term. We have also to change French society and French politics if we want to not be in a mess.
Yves, thank you very much indeed. One of the issues that many people are lamenting the absence of in this campaign is that of the environment. Paris, of course, very central in the planning to try and save the planet, of course, the accords that were signed here in Paris not so long ago. There's been a march recently, of course, to try and raise this in the presidential campaign. Let's take a listen to some of the protesters, demonstrators talking and basically hearing their words about green issues.
Les énergies fossiles qui rendent la terre stérile. On n'en parle plus du tout, je regarde même plus les infos, j'en ai tellement marre.
Le débat politique, il n'est pas du tout centré sur ce qu'il y a d'essentiel, en tout cas sur ce qui est possible d'anticiper.
Ça devient de plus en plus urgent et on a l'impression que même des faits scientifiques, ça fait pas bouger grand monde.
No opposition in Parliament, Nicolas, but opposition in the streets is what you've just said to me whilst that was going out. And we saw that demonstration there, which kind of is indicative of what you're talking about completely. Before I bring you back in, sir, can I go to Ariane in Northumbria at Newcastle upon Tyne at the University of Northumbria, lecture in French and politics. Ariane, is it the old saying, be careful what you wish for because it might come true? Is that what could be happening here in France, do you think?
Yeah, definitely. As I said at the beginning, there is a chance for Marine Le Pen to win. Then, as others have said, her ability to actually implement a program will depend on the parliamentary election. I don't think she will win an absolute majority just with her party, but there will definitely be people on the right who, power attracts, and I'm pretty sure that a lot of people on the right, will join her. But we will have to see if she is elected. We will have to see. We will have to wait until the parliamentary election, and there might be a backlash, a kind of, "Ooh, what have we done?" And suddenly we are entering into a cohabitation period. So yes, it's extremely volatile at the minute, very uncertain, and I have no idea what's going to happen.
Ariane, my first election here in France was 2007. I came over in 2006 when France 24, France 24 began. Mm-hmm. To help start it all up, exciting times. Then the first election came up, and I was talking to a colleague about the possibility of the National Front, then led by Jean-Marie Le Pen, gaining power. And they said there's no way that would happen because what happens is that if he does get through, there's a big sort of Republican coalition which comes together to make sure the far right never gets in power. It'll never happen in France. What's changed in this country?
You are correct, but you are talking about a totally different party. Jean-Marie Le Pen is not Marine Le Pen. What she's done since 2012 is the detoxification of a party, the normalization of a party to appear far more moderate. She the language is much smoother. The rhetoric has been dialed down. And if we look at this campaign in particular, she's focusing on, the cost of living, on social and economic issues. She's barely talking about immigration. She's barely talking about Islam. And she's been further normalized by Zemmour, because Zemmour is so extreme, is so, such a firebrand that in comparison to him, she appears very moderate. And let's not forget that mainstream political parties also are responsible for that, because many of them have used some of the topics, some of the themes, and have made a mainstream. If we look at Sarkozy, the first thing he did was to create a minister that was called Minister of Immigration, Integration and National Identity. That's a far right marker. Then we had the big debate over national identity, then the debate over the burqa. All of this has normalized Marine Le Pen, and the mainstream politicians have a lot to answer for as well. So it's a kind of dual movement. She normalized herself, and mainstream politicians normalize her as well. So and here we are, and we have no idea what's going to happen on Sunday, this Sunday, or in 2 weeks' time.
And Ariane, when Emmanuel Macron goes on main TV here in France and says to French people, you're going to have to work till you're 65 at least, that is something that doesn't resonate well, doesn't go down well with them, and they start looking towards the type of policies you've just been speaking about. Ariane, thank you. We've got Nicolas and Philip here dying to say things here. So, Nicolas, I'll bring you in first.
Thank you. I agree with Ariane, and I agree with Yves. I think we're in dangerous times. I think we're in dangerous times because a lot of people will feel that since they don't have the old left and the old right to vote for, that their voice was not heard, they won't be represented, and therefore, as I've said in other media, the problem is that the election, that they will think that since there's no real opposition in Parliament, that the opposition will come in the streets. This election, and this is where I think we also need to realize that the danger still exists that we thought was over. This election is very similar to the US in 2016 and to Brexit in 2016 in this sense that it is about we're sitting here in Paris, we're talking about should Macron have been talking to Putin? We're sitting here thinking about global issues, thinking about whether, if Marine Le Pen is elected, that'll be a disaster for French leadership in Europe. The average voter doesn't care about that. The average voter, the divide here is not left-right, it's not rich-poor, it's those who are globalized and future-looking and those who feel left behind. And, if you go out of the sort of what the French call the microcosm of Paris, and you see there are a lot of places in this country, which is a wonderful country and very beautiful and very attractive to tourists, especially British tourists. But the fact is there are a lot of places in this country where there's not a lot going on. And if you look at the Grand Est, for example, or the North, these old industrial wastelands, nobody would go there to seek an opportunity, and people leave from there to seek an opportunity. But there's a lot of hopelessness. And Macron has not been good at giving people hope, at saying, I care about you, I'm going to make things better. I believe that in 2017, his electoral model was Obama, but Obama gave people hope. He let them down after that. But Macron is not good at giving them hope. And if he loses, as I said a year ago Monday in an article that was published, that the election can be won or lost not on the facts, but on the feelings. And I think a lot of these people will vote their feelings, and when they vote their feelings, they'll just say, he's too far away from me, and I'm going to vote for somebody who says she cares about me, even if Marine Le Pen is not really ready to govern, because this is not, you don't have the one issue voting here like you do in the United States, for example. But it's your vote. But the point is, to put it simply, this election is not about the issues; it's about the individuals. It's
Nicolas,
about the
thank you very much indeed. Marine Le Pen, of course, accepting millions from Russia to reboot her party. Let's point that out as well. Close to Vladimir Putin. Maybe that might change because of the war. I don't know. We don't know. Philip, your thoughts?
I don't think so.
Final thoughts?
I don't think so. And I think one of the points we have to underline here is that for this election, we've seen a total disintegration of the traditional right and the traditional left in France. If you think back to François Hollande was the Socialist Party president François Mitterrand was the Socialist Party president, the candidate this time round is only credited with 2% of the vote in the first round, which is a historic low. Even last time, Benoît Hamon got 6%. This time, the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, is the national candidate for the Socialist Party. It was only credited with 2%. On the right, the party of Jacques Chirac, the party of Nicolas Sarkozy, you have Valérie Pécresse, who's only credited with between 8 and 10% of the vote. So what we could also see here is the disintegration of those parties. Will they survive this election? Will they have to rebuild themselves, rename themselves, recreate a new movement? All of that is not good news for democracy in France. That's also given more emphasis and more energy to Marine Le Pen. And you're quite right that Emmanuel Macron has failed to portray himself as a caring man. He's still portrayed as the man of the rich, the president of the rich people. And the France down below that was christened by Nicolas Sarkozy that way, they feel left behind. And I'm sure that if this election ends up with Emmanuel Macron re-elected, we could see a return pretty rapidly of the yellow vest protesters.
I totally agree.
Because they feel left behind.
We need to leave it there, I'm afraid, but what a debate. Philip, thank you very much indeed. Thank you to Yves Saint-Omer joining us from Berlin. Thank you to Ariane Bourgain in Newcastle upon Tyne. Great to see you. And thanks to Nicholas Dungan here in the studio. Thanks most of all to you for watching. Stay with us. More coverage of the presidential election, the campaign, and of course, special programming on Sunday. Stay with us, of course, here in France 24 for all the news.